What's going on, guys? It's John from Write Creative, and today I'm going to be starting a new series that I'm calling How to Code It. And basically, this series is just going to be me showing you how to code different sections or elements of different websites. So basically, if there's a website that you come across and maybe something that you saw that you really like and want to know how to go about creating it for your own needs, leave me a comment and maybe I'll cover it in an upcoming episode. But today I'm going to be kicking things off with one of my favorite websites, which is Ueno. I think I'm saying that correctly. But Ueno is a design agency based out of California, and I have to say everything on their site is incredibly well done. If you ever need design inspiration, these guys are always at the top of my list. But today, I'm going to be starting out just super simple and focusing on this little menu button up here. And as you can see, it's just a simple little menu icon that has a really elegant animation that happens whenever you click on it. It's super subtle, super clean, and just nicely done. So that's what we're going to be building today. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So whenever I'm getting ready to code anything that has an animation component to it, I always like to start by taking a screen recording of that animation happening. That way I can slow it down and really just get a better understanding of what's happening in that animation. So before I started recording this, I went ahead and recorded the animation that happens when you click on the button. And as I step through it, you can kind of start to see a little bit more easily what's happening when that button is pressed. So basically there's two bars, and the top bar looks like it rotates almost a full rotation, not quite a full rotation, maybe 3/4 of one. And the bottom bar rotates up to about, looks like 45 degrees, and then they crisscross in the middle. So that is going to be what we're recreating. And we're going to try and do this with as little code as possible. So let's just get started with the HTML. So before we get started writing the HTML, I have a new project set up here on CodePen. And if you're unfamiliar with CodePen, it's really just a cool site that lets you quickly write pieces of code and see the results directly in your browser. And so, as you can see, there's a space to write your HTML, your CSS, and your JavaScript. And I'll be sure to include a link below both to CodePen and the project that I'm creating today for your own reference. That way, if you want to utilize it in your own projects, you can check out kind of what I'm doing here. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start writing the HTML for this button. And just before I do that, I always like to, before I write any HTML, I really like to try and just take a moment and think of what is the appropriate element or elements for what we're trying to create. So in this instance, I believe a button tag is going to be the appropriate HTML for this. Now, some of you might be tempted to use an A tag, and really this isn't a link. You're not linking to another site or even somewhere else down the page. So I really think just a button is the appropriate HTML for this. So with that said, let's create a button tag in the HTML portion of CodePen. So we'll just do button, button. Now, for the sake of making this semantic or accessible, we're actually going to put the word menu inside of here, which we will eventually hide, but if you're using a screen reader or something like that, having this menu button is going to help describe what this is a little bit more. And we're also going to give this a title called menu, and let's give it a class called we'll call it spinning menu icon. And I think that should about do it for the HTML. Just so you're aware, as we get into some of the CSS, So this button has 2 bars. Now, if there was 3 bars, we may have needed to have put a div or something inside of here. But because there's only 2, I think we're going to be able to get away with using some tricky CSS to accomplish this without any further HTML. So for the HTML portion, you can't get much better than just a single piece of code, a single element. So that wraps up the HTML portion. Now we're going to move on to the JavaScript. Okay, with our HTML written, let's turn our attention to the JavaScript for a bit. Now, the JavaScript piece of this is going to be really minimal, and doing it first is really going to help make styling the buttons a bit easier. So the objective here is basically to toggle a single class on the button whenever we click on it. And this is really simple to do with just plain vanilla JavaScript. And I'm using vanilla JavaScript simply because it's the most universal option out there. There aren't any external requirements needed like jQuery or something like that. And you should be able to just copy and paste this into just about any website you're working on and have it work without too many issues. So let's just dive right into this JavaScript. And all we're going to do is first we're going to store the button into a variable. So we're going to say var btn equals document.query selector dot spinning menu icon. And basically what this line does is it just basically looks for our button or an element with the class with spinning menu icon, and it sets it to this variable btn or button. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to detect the on-click event. So basically whenever we click on this, we're going to get to define what happens. So we'll start by saying btn, which is the variable we just made, dot onClick equals function. And so basically whenever somebody clicks on the button, what happens, or what we put inside these curly braces is what's going to happen. And so all we want to happen is for the class to just get toggled. So we're going to say this dot class list dot toggle active. And so what this line does, well, it will toggle a class. It'll add an active class if it doesn't exist, and if it does exist, it'll take it away. So I'm going to open up the inspector real quick here, and you'll see my button right here, and you'll see that when I click it, it gets the class active. When I click it again, that active class gets taken away. So it's just toggling that class on and off every time you click on it. And this is all the JavaScript we're going to need for what we're doing today. So again, we don't need this extra line here. 4 lines of JavaScript. Again, that's really not bad. That's pretty easy. So with HTML and the JavaScript done, the last thing that we are going to turn to is the CSS. All right, the final portion of this is going to be the CSS, and this is probably going to be the most involved portion of this project. Now, typically I write CSS using Sass, but it occurred to me that maybe not everybody watching these videos is going to be familiar with Sass. So maybe in a future video, I'll do an intro to writing CSS using Sass, but for today, we're just going to use good old-fashioned CSS. For those of you who know how to write CSS using Sass or less, this should be super easy for you to convert, but for those who aren't familiar, well, this is for you. So let's just dive into writing some styles for our button. So we're going to start by just some general button styling. So we'll say spinning menu icon. And we're going to start by saying position, relative, display block. And we're going to give it a width and a height. So we're going to say width 40 pixels, height 40 pixels. And if you're wondering where those numbers come from, we want to make sure that the button is big enough for you to tap it easily on a mobile device. A common mistake that I see with a lot of times when people are making like these hamburger icons or menu icons is they restrict the clickable area to just the little bars and the space in between them, and it makes them really hard to tap the right space. So in this instance, we're going to make the button a nice big area, so if you tap anywhere inside of this, it's still going to trigger it. So next we're going to set the text indent to something like a -1000 pixels. That way it gets that word menu out of there. And we're also going to set the overflow to hidden, just so it doesn't show up on some random device. We're going to say appearance none, and that will clear out all of the default styling that the browser adds to a button. And we're going to say outline none. That will take away any outlines that are there whenever you click on the button. We're going to set the cursor to pointer so that when you hover over it, it looks like it's something that can be clicked. I'm going to say border. You know what? I'm going to keep the border to 1 pixel. That way we can kind of see where we're at as we're making these bars and make sure everything's centered. But eventually we're going to take that border away. And then lastly, I'm going to set the background color to transparent to clear out that gray background there. Okay, that should be good for the icon for right now. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the before and after pseudo classes to set up our bars. So what that looks like is we'll say spinning menu icon before and spinning menu icon after. Oops. And so I can tell you, I measured these off screen, so you can take my word for it, but these bars are 20 pixels wide, they're 2 pixels tall, and there's about 4 pixels of spacing between them. So with that knowledge, we're going to say width 20 pixels, height 2 pixels. Anytime you're using these before and after pseudo classes in CSS, you have to have a content property. It won't work if that isn't specified. Now, we don't have to put anything in here, but it just has to be there. We're going to say background color is black. Say position absolute. Position, oops. We're going to say display block. There our bars are starting to show up. Here's a little trick. If you want things to be centered vertically when they're absolutely positioned, you can always say left 0, right 0, margin 0 auto, and that will center things up. I think that's about it for these are the common factors, the common elements. So let's do the spinning menu icon before. We're going to say the top's going to be 15 pixels, and then for the bottom one, bottom 15 pixels, and that gets the 4 pixels in between them. So they're both going from 15 pixels from the top and the bottom. And now we're going to write some CSS for what happens when you actually click on them. So we're going to go back up to the top here, and we're going to say spinning menu icon active before, and then we'll do one for the bottom one as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to transform these. So we're going to use a transform property, and we're going to say rotate. That does, I think, 3/4 spin. So if I did 45 degrees, that would rotate it at an angle. If I did 90 degrees, it would be straight up and down. 180 degrees would be a full flip. So if it's 90 degrees, I'm thinking 90 plus another 45 degrees would be 135 degrees. Sounds about right. And I think the bottom menu, I think that just rotated up a little bit. So we're going to say transform rotate 45 degrees. And what you'll see happening is when you click on this now that's not quite what we're going for, but you'll see something is happening at least whenever it gets this active state. It's changing the before and after to rotate. Now, the reason these aren't quite lined up is the y coordinate is a little bit off. We want these crisscrossing right in the center of this square. So again, I figured this out off screen. Really, if you need to figure it out, you're just going to have to do some tinkering with it, but I'm just going to give you the shortcut and say the translate y. For the top one, we're going to push that down 3 pixels, and then for the bottom one, we're going to pull it up 3 pixels. And you can see, oops, that needs to be negative. And you can see that then they now crisscross right in the middle. So now whenever you click, you get a nice perfect X. And again, sometimes if you're trying to figure these things out, you just have to tinker with the numbers a little bit. But basically this translate y moves the bar vertically up or down, depending on whether that's a positive or a negative number. Now, the last piece of this is a very start change. It's just going from one to the other. We want that to animate. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the transition property on the before and after. So we're going to say transition. We only want it to apply it to the transform property. We're going to say we want it to take about 0.3 seconds and we want it to be linear. And this is where really the magic's going to happen. So now you'll see if we click on this, we get a nice smooth animation every time you click on it and it undoes itself. So we're almost done. The last thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this border. So we're going to change that to 0. And when that happens, it spaces these bars out just a little bit. So we lost 2 pixels from the top and the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add these down here. So we're going to change that to 16 instead of 15. And you'll see that brings them a little bit closer together again. And that pretty much wraps up our button. So we have 42 lines of CSS. That's not terrible. And very little HTML and JavaScript. So all in all, it's pretty succinct code and it gets the job done. So that pretty much wraps up this edition. As I said before, if there's ever any website or section of a website or element that you would like to know how to code, leave a comment and maybe I'll tackle it in another upcoming video. But until then, that pretty much wraps this one up. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.